And this is Fire Up, but we're taking a different tack today, at least for the first half. I've got two special guests. We've got Yvonne Sampson, who is the co-anchor for most of what you see on Fox League, as well as a couple of television shows that are separate to that as well, League Life and Big League Rap. She's here with us today. And Ian Darling, who is the director behind this film, The Final Quarter, of which this song stems from. Good morning to both of you. How are you?
Good morning.
Ian, we're going to talk to you first up. The film, Chris and I saw it yesterday, and it is extraordinarily sad, and it's not surprising. I think that what we saw yesterday is something that we all know, but somehow the way you've put it together with just found audio, video, without I can tell the story, but there's not a bias inherent in what you're trying to do, except put forward the truth. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, I think that's the really powerful thing when you're dealing with archival footage is you can get closer to the truth. It's the first film I've made using this technique. I was very much influenced by films like Senna and Amy, and I thought in this instance it was worth a crack at it. We never knew exactly what would come out of it, so we started looking at literally hundreds of hours of footage. And
what were you aiming for?
I was so disturbed by what happened over those 3 years of Adam Goods's final years of his career, but I didn't really understand it. I was so confused as to what was happening and how we as a nation literally booed this champion out of the game.
Out of the game, yeah.
How could we do this? What was that saying about us? And we all came up with every excuse, but I wanted to go back and get as close to the truth as I could. And, I've made many films where I've interviewed lots of people, and I think you can...
If we could, you made a film on Paul Kelly, the Susie, the film?
Susie and Simple Man, and then 10 years ago, a film called The Oasis.
The Oasis, which is about the Crown Street kids.
Homeless shelter. Yeah. But in all the films, and in the Paul Kelly film, for example, we interviewed about 50 people, and whenever you're being interviewed, you're naturally thinking about what the documentary is going to be about and how to answer it and how to reveal yourself. Yeah. But when you're going back, not a single person was interviewed for this film. Everyone reveals themselves in this film just by being themselves.
And I think, interesting enough, Adam Goods doesn't really... it's not like you've actually said to him, what do you think about this situation? You get a glimpse of what he's feeling and thinking, obviously, and his mother says a couple of lines, but essentially he's nearly sort of the back end of the storyline, in the sense that he doesn't sort of say, this is what I hate, this is what I love, this is what it's done to me. But you know it, you feel it. Well,
I think one of the things that jumped out when we started looking at all the footage is how much Adam actually spoke over that period, both as a footballer, but also right in the middle of it, he was Australian of the Year. And he was out talking about Indigenous issues every week. And as you say, he wasn't there saying stop booing or this is terrible. He was actually just with such dignity and grace. Standing up, trying to gently educate us about Indigenous issues and history and the power of listening. And in many ways, the more he spoke, the more he started to get booed. I mean, in the film you can almost see a correlation that there was no booing in 2013. It actually happened when he was appointed Australian of the Year.
There are a couple of key moments, aren't there? Obviously, there was him pointing out the person who happened to be a 13-year-old girl. Of course, he was attacked for that, even though he defended and protected the girl as much as he could. And of course, there was the dance during, I think it was Indigenous round. And there was a very funny line that Charlie Pickering says. One of the commentators, and there's a lot. You cut to a lot of commentators to get their point of view, how they're all grappling, and they're not grappling with it very well, this whole scenario, because they're obviously justifying themselves half the time, and Eddie Maguire, of course, comes in for a lot of sort of, I don't know, I guess confused points of views, and Charlie Pickering says, somebody says, well, we want this to be explained to us so we know what he's going to do, because Indigenous round, if he told us he was going to do a tribal dance, then at least we would know how to celebrate that. And Charlie Pickering goes, well, he is Indigenous. He's wearing a jumper made by his mother, which is definitely Indigenous. The football is designed in an Indigenous fashion, and it's Indigenous week. What more do you need to say?
No, I think that's right. And in many ways it was a metaphor for a larger issue in Australia, that when something's presented to us that we don't understand, we put our back up and we get defensive and we comment without actually making a decision and making an informed decision and trying to learn. And so I think the war dance was a bit like, when the First Nations people presented the Uluru Statement from the Heart to the government. the government suddenly said, I don't know how to deal with this. They got their back up and they got defensive and they said no. It was one of the greatest gifts. And Adam's War Dance, again, was just such a generous gift during Indigenous Round to celebrate his culture. And that's what Indigenous Round's all about celebrating Indigenous culture. And Indigenous players represent over 10% of the AFL.
Yeah.
It's probably even greater in
It is, yeah. We're about 12% in the NRL, and it's quite extraordinary given there's about less than 3% in the Australian population that identify as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander.
And Yvonne, if I could ask you, you have direct contact with a lot of the Indigenous football players. We see Adam Goodes and the likes of Greg Inglis and James Roberts, etc., sportsmen at the top of their game. We assume they're strong, fit men at the peak of their abilities, but really they're hurting inside, aren't they? And I think it's particular to our Indigenous population that racism has a different and more compounded effect than, say, if you're of Chinese background here or Lebanese background or whatever, because it's compounded from centuries of pain, dispossession, suffering, etc., etc.
And there's just a lack of acknowledgement and respect that goes along. And when you get, say, Greg Inglis is a great example for the NRL, all of a sudden you're expected to be a leader, you're expected to have a voice and represent your community, and not often is that the most comfortable thing for young Indigenous men to do who have a sense of displacement. They're still struggling with their sense of self. They've been, their backgrounds perhaps taken away from their families at a very early age and jettisoned into an NRL environment.
Expect to be role models.
That's right, and they lose that connection to country, they lose that connection to community, and so therefore they're struggling with their own identity themselves, and yet they're supposed to stand up and be, very proud and represent their entire community and be a spokesperson. And I know Greg really struggled with that for a long time. Jonathan Thurston's another example. He didn't really know because there's a lot of sense of shame and especially from the elders, move on, let's not talk about our heritage, and so they actually don't know a lot about their own heritage and their own culture.
Off air about your experience, that there is sometimes a disconnect or an ignorance about your background as well?
Yeah, well, I'm adopted from Townsville, and so I never really knew a lot about my birth family, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago when my birth father called me on Boxing Day and he said, I always thought that his mum, so my birth grandmother, had died, but she hadn't. He was taken away from her in Charters Towers because she was a young Indigenous woman who had a baby to, one of the white Australians in the town, and she was deemed not fit enough to raise that baby. So he grew up never knowing his mother, and she grew up thinking that her baby had died. She took her baby to hospital and they told her that the baby had died. She never got a death certificate or anything like that. So, and that's not even that long ago. This was in the 70s or 60s, So, and you would never think that stolen generation would come knocking at your door, but it still happens. And because there's so much trauma that has happened to our Indigenous and population, they want to move on, and so they don't talk about the atrocities, the genocide, everything that's happened in our Australian culture. And Jonathan Thurston didn't understand any of that until he went to the Indigenous All-Stars camp, and they said, go back, talk to your families, understand where you're from. And so from there they get that sense of self and that sense of pride and that sense of respect from where they're from and where they're headed.
Wow.
Yeah, the interesting thing you were saying there, Yvonne, about the move on, I think that's reflected in Adam Goodes in the movie, and he said, I really wasn't aware a lot of this, and the movie charts the incident with the girl. He becomes Australian of the Year, and I think he takes up his cause with bravery and immense vigour. But there's a turning point in the movie, which is the incident you're referring to in the Indigenous Round where he does the war dance, which the under-16 kiddies had taught him at the Carlton game, and then it just got relentless and it wears him down. So at the end of that season, he retires and, famously doesn't appear at the grand final. We're now 3 to 4 years on. He's seen the movie?
We shared the film with him in December last year, which was the sort of final cut. It was a really, really difficult screening.
You were in the room with him?
He wanted to watch it by himself.
I bet he did,
but
yeah.
then Sally and I came in and we just spoke for, about an hour, and a lot of it was in silence, and it was just so difficult for him to watch, and it brought up so many.
I can't imagine being in that situation. Yeah.
And I felt really uncomfortable even sharing it with him. But I'd shown it to Mickey O'Loughlin and Tanya Hosh and Karen Mundine before, and they said, no, this is something Adam is ready to see.
Since you've had incredible impact, because I think it's going to the schools at some level. Tell us about that, and also you've played it to all the AFL heads and body and club coaches or club ownership have all taken...
So we thought it was really important to bring the AFL alongside what we're wanting to do, because this actually happened in the arena, in their turf.
It happened on their watch, can I say? As in the rugby league community, we were devastated that was happening, and it made us look at ourselves. And look, I'm the first to say the NRL has its own set of issues, and Karen Davis, who works for the UN, she's on the ARL Commission. She's undergoing a cultural review, and she called what the rugby league's going through a cultural reckoning. However, the rugby league's attitude towards Indigenous people involved, whether it be players or in the broader scope, we were devastated. We would never think that we would ever boo an Arthur Beetson or a Greg Inglis or any of our Indigenous stars. It was so far beyond anything that we ever could have understood. And
do you know why? Do you have a theory on that?
Respect, I think. I think the tone. I think, and look, I'm not here to say rugby league doesn't have.
We've got a lot
racial
of
issues. Yeah, I know, and it does. It has, for God, yeah. But I think for us, we were able to hold up a mirror and say, at least for that, that is something devastating for us to see.
It was systemic and sustained. That was the thing.
It was, and I think the institutional response by the AFL was totally inadequate. The thing which I found really pleasing is when I first raised it with Gil McLaughlin, who's the CEO, and Tanya Hosh, who's the executive of inclusion there. Tanya had been working, she wasn't there at the time at the AFL, and she'd been working very hard on trying to bring in a whole lot of new measures. So when I went in and said, I'm making this, there was no sense of defensiveness at all. There was, we're actually ready for this, and we know we stuffed up, and I think we've got a second chance at it. And it was really difficult for them to watch. The AFL does not come off well, but they've had so far a really honest response.
What about those that were defending the other side? Have you had any response from Alan Jones, Miranda Devine, Sam Newman? The list goes on.
People will come up with a sort of a point of view that's logic-based. So in the height of it, where every week they're booing Goods, the position would be, there are 78 other Indigenous players, why aren't they booing them? Therefore, it's not because of that issue. Yeah. And there's something very seductive about that logic. And it most interestingly played out to me in the movie where the as you'd have Yvonne on Fox League, the ex-footy players, and they're kind of torn. I mean, I think we were talking before off air about Nathan Buckley, and he goes, well, why can't they focus on what was great about Adam rather than this? And it's Mark Robinson, who's sort of almost as a heroic figure in this movie, saying he needs our help, he needs our support. It has to be talked about. And that's what I think is so compelling about the movie. And I would have said, this is a compulsory schools text, but it's already going to the kiddies. So
so it's being donated to every school with incredible curriculum resources. But just coming back on that point, I think in a 24-hour news cycle, there's so much commentary, and sports commentators are being called on to answer questions on things that aren't necessarily part of their brief. And when suddenly racism comes up, you could see just how difficult it was. And I felt for them, but I think what we've got to do looking forward is, where was the diversity on all these panels? Why weren't there Indigenous voices on those panels? Even in Indigenous round, if there was an Indigenous person there when they were being critical of the war dance, it just would have instantly gone away, going, no, this is a celebration. This is what Adam's doing. He's learnt it from the under 16-year-old bombers. Given the whole thing context, and I think that would be really powerful for the non-Indigenous commentators, but it would just lead to a much more real conversation where we wouldn't get into these clumsy discussions that cause great harm. Because again, coming back to the one of the original intents is I wanted to show the power of words in this, and you can't escape them. And that people are very loose with words, and that's where we get this casual racism or the unconscious bias. But the damage done by these words is quite profound.
Yes, it's powerful. The final quarter about the ending of the career of Adam Goodes. When it comes out, I recommend everybody go and see it. And we'll come back to Fire Up with Yvonne to talk some silly shit in just a minute. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks.
Fire it up! Ready to go! Fired up! Ready to go!